of the things that doesn't get talked about enough, in my view anyway, about Russiagate is the victims. I mean, of course, Russiagate is mainly this scandal, this hoax that alleged that Trump was a Russian agent. And that whole thing is so preposterous that, of course, it kind of sucks up all the oxygen and it makes you just so mad thinking about the fact that that happened, that the media ran with it for 4 years and so on and so forth. I think we should talk about everyday people who just got sucked into it by Mueller or by the FBI or by whoever. Well, we're going to get into all that. And they had their lives ruined, their businesses ruined, their families ruined, their health ruined. It's just an absolute bloodbath in terms of what happened to just ordinary people. And I think it's not talked about enough. But of course, there's a reason why I think we should talk about it now. And that is that maybe we'll finally have a chance for redemption. And that is if Trump gets reelected on November 5th. Maybe there will be a chance that these people will finally have some justice.
Well, it's a great topic, and it's something that's so easily, as you said, overlooked. You know, in their quest to get Trump, the left was basically climbing up and attacking anybody in his orbit as a means to get to Trump. And the obvious one that probably comes to mind is General Flynn. And I always think back to at the time of the Republican convention in 2016, when Michael Isikoff did an ambush interview of the general and brought up the Flynn's dinner, Russian dinner, at which Jill Stein was present. And that was the same time, Robbie Mook had just invoked Russia. And that was the setting of the hook. And Flynn obviously had no idea. He thought he was going to be talking about his position, within the Trump campaign. I'm not sure. I don't think he was officially the national security advisor at that point. Maybe that had just happened. But regardless, they used that as kind of the hook. And that was a perfect example because, of course, Flynn's life was utterly torn apart, all in a quest to establish a Russian collusion narrative. And, there was really nobody was off limits, right? We've seen that extend, even in the lawfare against Trump, we've seen that extend to going after all of Trump's lawyers. So if you happen to be in any way affiliated, any way that you could be grasped onto as a means to climb up to get Trump, then you were fair game, regardless of what you had or hadn't done. And it's kind of emblematic because, when you and I have talked before, we've tried to impress upon people the damage done by this Russia collusion narrative, that it polluted the entirety of our foreign policy and is still doing so to this very day. But there were so many victims as well along the way of this, all in pursuit of political gain.
Absolutely right. And we'll go through the list. They had Sergei Millian, you had Akim Alptekin, you had Michael Caputo. I mean, it's a long list. But why don't we start with General Flynn? Because he was, as you say, he was kind of the original victim of all of this. I mean, other than Trump, of course, we all know that. And we're not just now talking about sort of the collateral victims. It was an attack on Trump, but they as you just rightly said, they couldn't have cared less about any collateral victims that lay kind of by the wayside in terms of their goal. And their goal was to get Trump. And Flynn was the original one, absolutely right. But he was about getting to Trump, but he was also about crippling the Trump administration. He was about everything. That's why he was the first. That's why he was at the core of this, because of course, it started, as you say, in July of 2016. Then it carried over into an absolutely fraudulent and FBI investigation. They investigated Michael Flynn. They had national security letters against him. They did all kinds of awful things. We're still talking 2016 here, on the basis of absolutely nothing. He had done nothing wrong. Well, as you said, he'd been to Moscow once for a dinner. But if you look at who else was at that dinner, it was Jill Stein, but there was many other people. There were German politicians, Eastern European politicians, various other characters. I think there was the owner of an NBA team. I mean, there's all sorts of people.
Yeah, the dinner was for which is Russia, RT television. That's what it was, and it got parlayed.
Exactly. So Bill Clinton was in Moscow giving speeches. So is that a reason to do all that against Bill Clinton? Of course, that never happened. Maybe it should be because he got a lot of money. But that's the point, that they just took this absolutely nothing event and blew it up into this ginormous thing. Now, of course, there was nothing there and it was never going to go anywhere. But in the meantime, they tied him up in an investigation. And the point of doing that, even if the investigation is never ever going to go anywhere, is that you can then do things, which is what they did in early January or in January of 2017, which is you can go and interview the person, because after all, the person's under investigation. You know, the one thing is just a door to the next. And of course, that was the infamous ambush interview of Flynn. Now that gets sort of interpreted or misrepresented very frequently in terms of Flynn having done something wrong. He never did anything wrong. He never lied. He never said anything that was remotely untrue. It was like absolutely fine. He did nothing wrong whatsoever. But you need the interview for the next step, which is to accuse him of having lied in the interview. So you need every single thing along the way. If he didn't it didn't matter what he said at the interview. They were always just going to say, "Oh, you lied." He told the truth, didn't matter. Doesn't matter. You need the interview in order to then to say, "Oh, he lied." And then you take it further. They gave it to Mueller, and then of course Mueller he went absolutely crazy in terms of threatening to indict Michael Flynn's son and do all kinds of horrible things to his family. They bankrupted the guy. He had to sell his house just to pay lawyers. I mean, when you get sucked into one of these situations, even if you have done nothing wrong, which in his case is 100% proven, absolutely proven, it is an absolute nightmare. It ruins everything. You can't sleep. You don't know where you're gonna get your money from. You don't know where just everything is a mess. Your whole life is turned upside down. And it's absolutely horrendous what they did to that guy. And again, for those who don't remember what he was accused of, and it's a very, very, very simple thing, but I don't think it's ever been really properly explained, even by the side of the media that ought to be, telling the truth on this. Maybe because of years and years of lies in the other side of the media, the legacy media, that is sort of so entrenched that people start believing these things that are said about Michael Flynn. So here's what it comes down to. It's very, very, very simple. Michael Flynn talked to the Russian ambassador, as you mentioned, before Trump came in, like a few weeks. But that was his job. By the way, Michael Flynn at the time had a government-issued phone. He had a government-issued email address because he was on the transition. So that's, he was quasi-government at that point. It's his job to talk to all these people. So one of the people he talked to was the Russian ambassador. Now, they made up this hoax where they were going to accuse him of having talked to the Russian ambassador about sanctions because Obama had issued some sanctions against Russia. And that was going to be the accusation, whether he said it or not. And that this is the cruel part. They went to Peter Strzok went to ambush interview Michael Flynn, like, "Oh, did you talk about sanctions?" He said no. And then they accused him of lying about talking about sanctions. That's the gist of it. That's the entire case. Well, guess what? Eventually, it took many, many years to kind of pry this out of the government's hands, but eventually we got the transcript, the exact transcript of Michael Flynn's phone call, which the government was listening in on with the Russian ambassador. And guess what? Michael Flynn never once talked about sanctions. The entire thing had been made up. And that's the end of it. He completely 100% innocent. And yet, they put him through all that.
Well, and there's so, as you're talking, I have all these details flooding into my head that I want to get out all at once. But just thinking about that brief period of time, the FBI was aware. First of all, they were targeting him and listening in on his phone call. Secondarily, they determined, we know with hindsight, that he had actually said nothing wrong on the phone call. And then somewhere in a very brief span of time, somebody entered that picture and said, "We don't care that he didn't say anything wrong. We're going to proceed ahead. We want you to ambush interview him." And then it becomes a pretense of you did say something wrong, despite them knowing that he didn't. Also, they could create this narrative. And all of that happened in a span of, a month, a very compressed period of time. So, again, to impress upon people that the DOJ knew that he hadn't done anything wrong, and they pressed ahead anyway, asserting that he had done something wrong. And then, as you say, he enters this legal financial nightmare where you've got the weight of the weight and the financial might of the DOJ coming at you, and you either acquiesce that you're guilty or you leverage everything you possibly have to try to combat their lawyers, which are coming at you from all angles. And as everybody realizes, it's an unbelievably expensive process, that basically bankrupted him for something that he had never done anything wrong to begin with. It's cases like these that really, you probably were a lot more jaded than I was as a lawyer. But it was like, it was the Flynn case in particular, watching that really evolved my thinking. I used to kind of be naive, like, well, if you didn't do anything wrong, it's not going to be a big deal. You're able to quickly prove your innocence. And no, that is absolutely not the case. That's why the politicized lawfare that we see that's so prevalent in polluting our justice system, why it works. It's really frightening. And he was subjected to that for how many years? There's still people that are rabidly convinced that Michael Flynn, that General Flynn, did something wrong, and they call him a traitor or whatever. And he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and occupying the wrong position at the wrong time from the left's perspective. And here we are. I mean,
That's right.
in many ways, as I'm thinking about it, it almost seems like he's kind of the genesis of our. It's not that lawfare started with Flynn, it certainly didn't, but the current evolution of lawfare seemed to really take off with Flynn.
The absolute corruption, the evil that it takes to know that the guy never talked about sanctions and then still accuse him of it and then watch his entire life fall apart and be totally okay with that is completely sickening. And we're talking about people like Peter Strzok, who was there in the interview. We are talking about anyone who had a copy of the transcript. We're talking about all these Mueller thugs.
Pienka was there too, I think.
Yep, that's right. It's absolutely the other guy who was there for the ambush interview is this guy called Joe Pienka. Now he was kind of Strzok's sidekick for a while. He must have felt bad about what happened. But unfortunately, his remedy was not to pipe up or tell people the truth. What he did is he just disappeared off into the sunset. He got himself transferred somewhere into some desk position somewhere, I think out in San Francisco, whatever. He just wanted to get out of it all.
Yeah. And there was, at one point we looked into this, and there was a whole sequence. There's always movement within the FBI, obviously. But Comey suddenly cycled a whole number of officials both into and out of FBI headquarters. And he did it over kind of a 6-month period in the second half of 2016. And Pienka was one of those final ones, where I think, as you say, we've always kind of, seems like he's maybe, was one of those who wasn't comfortable with what was going on. And sure enough, he just gets shunted on and moved out. Now, if he never said anything, it seems like the whole culture of the FBI is rigged against that. Just the idea alone, and I just don't think it can be emphasized enough, that the FBI, the agents listening to that phone call determined that there was nothing wrong, nothing illegal, nothing incorrect about what Flynn said. And 2 days later, that was overruled in a whole, maybe not even 2 days later, it might even have been same day. But that determination was overruled to then go ahead and advance a weaponized case against Flynn that was completely fabricated.
Exactly, because even let's assume Flynn had talked about sanctions. Well, why not? I mean, he's talking to the Russian ambassador. He can talk about whatever they want. I mean, he's the incoming national security advisor. There's no reason not to talk about sanctions. It's totally ridiculous. But because, and this is what always happens with the media and the left and so on, they always take it one step further. They don't talk about, they didn't accuse him of talking about sanctions. They accused him of lying about talking about sanctions. And that's sort of the next level. And everyone starts talking about whether he lied. And then you kind of move on. You just take the sanctions part as given.
That's right.
And unfortunately, that was kind of the main problem with his case. You even had Pence and so on. They all kind of said, well, Flynn lied, and no one ever even looked at the premise of it all. And the reason why it was so important to take Flynn out, again, just to remind everyone, is because he was the only one there with Trump in the beginning who would have been a voice of not only reason, but truth and of independence and not establishment, sort of anti-establishment in one word.
Well, and a true insider, one who knows where all the
And
bodies
one
are
who
buried.
knew how this worked. That's exactly. I mean, look at all these characters. You had McGahn. That was the White House lawyer, ultimate kind of GOP elitist establishment type. He was the one who pushed for Twins ouster because it was like, oh, Flynn lied. What sort of people are that? You had Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. I don't know what his involvement there was, but obviously, big GOP elitist kind of type. You had Mike Pence, establishment, all these kinds of people. And it was really kind of Trump on his own. So it would have been very helpful having Flynn there. His office was very, very close to the Oval Office, just a couple of doors down, if I recall, to kind of just guide him through that. And, he was gone pretty much immediately because of this hoax. And that just makes me so angry, both in terms of what they did to Trump, but also, and it's obviously what we're focused on today, what they did to Flynn and his family. It's just absolutely beyond outrageous. The lawyers, we haven't even talked about the lawyers. I mean, they were absolutely horrendously conflicted because unfortunately he used the same lawyers that his company had used, and the lawyers, I don't want to make it too complicated, but the lawyers had already messed up a situation to do with Flynn's company. So in order to cover their tracks with their earlier mistakes, they sort of pushed Flynn to plead guilty to something he had never done. But even though I guess we'll never really know. But I think the main thing that pushed him was when they started threatening his son. I mean, when they start threatening your family, you kind of just give up, don't you? You're just like, okay, take it, have it, just leave my son alone, leave my family alone. But again, that in and of itself is so totally outrageous. And mind you, none of this has anything to do with Russia collusion, has nothing to do with any improper dealings with Russia or anything whatsoever. It's a so-called process crime where he's accused of lying about something which he never ever lied about. Going through it here, talking to you about it here, it just makes me angry all over again. It's one of those that we can talk about 100 times. I'm just going to get as angry or angrier each time that we talk about it.
Another thing to remember, too, is that this illustrated a strategy that the left employs. So they didn't just stop with Flynn, and by that I mean they weaponized Kislyak. So not that Kislyak's a good guy. I'm not trying to say that. But they used that to then take out Sessions. The fact that Sessions had simply been in the same room with Kislyak for like a minute. In another place, I think he kind of brushed shoulders with him or something. And they used that to get rid of Jeff Sessions. Now, that was Sessions' fault for being so weak. But nevertheless, they took that narrative, and it's as you were talking about, that they moved past the underlying details. Details, the actual facts, don't matter at all. Now we've created a narrative. Excuse me, our voice is going here. Now they've created a narrative where, Kislyak is just, anybody who touches Kislyak is now poisoned. And then they extrapolate that to Sessions, and they get Sessions removed as well, who literally was just happened to be in the same crowded room as him.
Which, by the way, if you're a senator, which Sessions was at the time, you're going to be at some function at some point where the Russian ambassador or any number of ambassadors are going to be.
The Russian ambassador's job is to meet with U.S. officials. That is the entire capacity.
Exactly. So, no, completely outrageous what they did there. And of course, it didn't end there. I mean, maybe the part that makes me most angry, and there's a lot to go on here, right? But this is the part where I'm really hoping for this redemption, and the redemption soon, is what happened at the end. So Flynn was completely absolved of any wrongdoing when this transcript came out. This cannot be emphasized enough. There was literally a transcript. Bill Barr finally got it out through a guy called Jensen. We'll talk about Barr some other time, but that was one little thing, one good thing. Maybe he just felt too bad in the end or whatever. So it came out. It was 4 years late, right? So 4 years of hell for General Flynn, but finally it came out. That was the end of it. That document, the transcript, proved beyond any doubt, just read it, that Flynn never talked about sanctions. That's it. Just didn't happen. Okay, end of story. The whole thing was made up. Let him move on. So DOJ said, okay, sorry, oopsie, we got it wrong. Let's just dismiss the case. And 100% of the time when that happens, the case is dismissed because, well, DOJ admits a big oopsie, which is, of course, it was much worse than an oopsie. But anyway, that's what they said. What does the judge do? Emmett Sullivan, not so fast. And he hires his own prosecutor to go after Flynn. I mean, if you'd written a kind of a novel about this, no one would believe it. It would be completely incredible. Like, no, this can't possibly, no, you just, and yet it happened. And it carried this Emmett Sullivan character carried this, I don't even want to call him a judge, he carried it on and on and on. It went on for another 6 months or so that Flynn was put through hell. I mean, you get the DOJ saying, oopsie, sorry, we messed up. You can go now. You can go home now and have your life back. And yet 6 months later, you're still in the same situation because of this one guy, Emmett Sullivan. It's absolutely sickening. And unfortunately, the only solution at that point was to give him a pardon. And then Trump gave Flynn a pardon. And that's, at that point, even Sullivan wasn't able to do anything. That's it. You get the pardon document and that it's over at that point. And then Flynn was finally free. But freedom through pardon is very different as compared to freedom through evidence that you are 100% innocent, which we have and we discussed. And this is where I hope there will be some redemption coming soon. It shouldn't have been a pardon. It should have been absolution of any wrongdoing because he didn't do anything wrong ever. And I think it should be more than that. It should also be some kind of role that General Flynn is given in a potential new Trump administration to kind of just make up for all the crap he had to go through.
Well, I think the entire point, you're dredging up old memories when we were following this case much more closely, and now I'm furious as well. And Sullivan, I always kind of figured that his job was to basically continue to perpetuate the myth and make sure that Flynn was fully tainted. That the DOJ, when they were finally forced to release the transcript, which they had, oops are bad. They knew what was in that transcript. That would have been a loss, and they couldn't go out with a loss, so they kept it going. And Emmett Sullivan kept it going, precisely so that Flynn was, kind of tainted for the rest of time. It also made me think back. We mentioned at the outset how Isikoff kind of kicked this thing off against Flynn, raising the Russia dinner. And that wasn't by chance. Isikoff had been involved with, is it Andrea Chalupa or Alexandra Chalupa, the sisters?
Alexandra,
was involved with Chalupa in dredging up the Ukraine kind of opposition to Trump. She was also the one that got involved with Manafort, the campaign against Manafort, helping to bring out the Black Ledger, all those things. Well, who was working with her? Isikoff, the entire time. Then Isikoff transitions to taking out Flynn, also kind of Manafort at the same time. New York Times ended up with that story, but he played a role in that. And then Isikoff goes on, and he becomes the one that in late September puts out the story that is discussing the dossier and that there's a deep source. He's literally sitting there interviewing Christopher Steele, and that's how that thing came about. And that's the sequence of events. That's in a span of 6 months. That's like March to September that Isikoff was intertwined through these actions as, as a DNC operative, not as a journalist.
Yeah, when we could probably move on to another victim here. We should probably talk about Carter Page next because that was something that Isikoff kicked off as well. But
yes.
Maybe before we do that, I just want to come back to this point you made about Sullivan, which is so important. I guess in my anger about this guy, it didn't even come out the fact that this wasn't some DC judge who woke up one morning and decided, oh, I need to go after Flynn, even though that is what he did. He went on this vendetta against Flynn. And to an extent, it was personal because, he was vicious. He was absolutely vicious about it. But you're absolutely right. Sullivan is just a cog in a much bigger wheel. He was acting on some form of instructions. We don't know whether direct, indirect, or, often I find that all these people media, Democrats, leftist activists, and so on, they all know their role. They all know what
Yeah.
to do. So I guess we'll never find out what really happened, but Sullivan knew, I need to dirty up this guy. He's just been completely absolved by DOJ. We can't let that stand. For the history books, we got to make it look like this guy was totally guilty. And the only way you do that is you force Trump to give the pardon, because then, of course, the guy looks guilty. And that was the entire intent of because Sullivan knew that ultimately this would lead to a pardon. It was like a given that was going to happen eventually. But you dirty him up so much until you get to that point that, as you say, people still believe the crap. People still believe the lies to this day. And DC is a small place in terms of the cocktail parties and who married whom and all this kind of stuff. One day, I don't think we'll ever find out, but I'd love to find out what exactly happened behind the scenes there with Sullivan, who was calling the shots, or whether it was just sort of implied that everyone knew their role.
I always wonder, how do these people sleep at night? I simply am unable to grasp the mentality that does this. The same thing applies to the FBI agents who had themselves determined that Flynn did nothing wrong in that phone call. And then that night or the next day, whatever, in a very compressed period of time, were effectively ordered to treat Flynn as if he had, knowing full well that themselves personally that he had not, and seemed to have no compunction with moving forward. I mean, certainly Strozak did exactly that. I can't wrap my head around that kind of mentality. And how do you sleep at night knowing what you did to somebody who had done nothing?
I can't either. And that, by the way, applies to these so-called journalists as well, who came after all these totally innocent people. How do they sleep at night? So you mentioned Isakov. He's got his fingerprints all over the map in terms of Russiagate, but unfortunately also in terms of smearing these victims and creating these victims. So he was one of the first who came after Carter Page. And of course, Carter Page is one of these complete and total victims in all of this. Now, I think he's not really perceived as much as a victim because he's so... He must be. I've never met him, but he must be. We've communicated, but I've never met the guy. I'd love to do that one day, because he just strikes me as just a really, really cool kind of guy, like totally laid back. He just wouldn't let these things affect him. When he found out that he was under investigation for a complete scam, he wrote that letter to Comey, and we could read the letter. It's very matter of fact, like, no, you guys got it wrong. He seems eminently kind of reasonable and laid back, and very, very few people, I think, could have maintained that kind of posture. Again, they spied on this guy for 1 year. They had access to everything that he had access to online in terms of emails, like everything. They searched his house without his knowledge, of course. Where he went traveling or whatever, and then they went in. They had people spy on him, humans, confidential human sources, so-called, like Halper. They just did everything possible to this guy just to dirty him up, because again, then they could say, oh, there's this dirty guy in Trump's orbit, and then use that to go after Trump. Of course, they never found anything. And in fact, he's maybe one of the reasons why he's not perceived so much as a victim is because they never brought charges. They never laid a hand on him. They never were able to. There was just nothing there. There wasn't even anything that they could make into something. Of course, with Flynn, there wasn't either, but they really needed to get Flynn for the reasons we discussed, because he was right there with Trump in the first few days. And of course, Carter Page was not. But yeah, what do you make of Carter? I always thought, wow, I don't think many people could have coped with that.
First of all, I really like Carter. As you've said, both of us have communicated with him. I found him to be a little quirky. Sometimes I almost found myself having a hard time always understanding some of the things that he was saying. Very bright. But it was that case that I think really ripped the cover off the whole FISA thing. We now know with hindsight that at least the first two of the four FISAs, if not all four of them, were issued completely fraudulently. And that's legal determinations. That's not us saying it. And that could be done. And you mentioned Halper, that they literally sicked a confidential human source onto him. I mean, he visited Carter at his house and vice versa, trying to record him surreptitiously. They never got anything on him. They manufactured an email. They literally reversed the intent of an email from the CIA, which exonerated Carter Page, rewrote it to do just the opposite, to implicate him, to use, without doing that, they couldn't have got the FISA. Without the Steele dossier, which was completely fraudulent, they couldn't have got the FISA. There's no accountability for that, and it ripped the Band-Aid off this whole, the FISA court and the FISAs were sort of, this super secret thing, and now we find out they could be issued on anybody at any time. They could be done on the fly. They could be done in a matter of like hours if necessary. It exposed all of that for being, really just a tool of the government as opposed to this special secret thing. And yeah, I always felt really bad for Carter. But as you say, he handled it really, very, very calmly and rationally. I know he's angry about it, but he was very rational in his approach, and nothing was ever found.
Even when that god-awful Boasberg, he was that judge. By the way, he was the chair of the FISA court.
Of the FISA court, yep.
And he happened to be, again, this is another thing. We could probably just talk about this forever. But how is it that all these important cases always happen to get drawn, because supposedly you just pick a name out of a hat, in exactly the way that the powers that be want it to be, that the establishment wants it to be? Like how on earth did the DC case, the Trump case, get assigned to Chutkan? That was the worst judge of any single judge that you could have picked, and that was the one that was picked. And so Boasberg was picked for the Kevin Kleinsmith. He was that FBI lawyer who forged the Carter Page email in order to progress this FISA application. That's forgery. That's absolutely terrible what he did. And he got a slap on the wrist by Boasberg. And when that happened, again, I remember Carter was on some show and he just seemed very philosophical about it all. I admire the fact that he can keep his cool with all these horrible things that were done to him. Now, another one, of course, is Sergei Millian. Again, for all these people, I really want redemption. I want these people to not only, be able to live their lives and all that, but truly not, first of all, get some kind of compensation. I think that's very important for what was done to them, but also just have history record that these people were victims in the truest sense of the word. Because we always are kind of conditioned to think that when someone is accused of something or whatever, that there is some kernel of truth to it. That's always the sort of thought process that we've all been conditioned to accept. Maybe the whole thing about Carter or whatever was exaggerated, but there must have been something. Flynn as well. I mean, that's sort of, and the one thing that, is the case with all of these people, other than Manafort, we'll maybe talk about him later on, is that there's no kernel of truth about anything. It was just all made up. And Sergei Millian is another one of those. He wasn't even in Trump's orbit. He wasn't even, the others, Carter at least got to call himself like Trump advisor. Sergei had nothing to do with anything. They just picked him out of, they found him online because he had once sold Trump apartments. He was a realtor and he had a Russian sounding name. So they were like, okay, let's pin this on him.
Well, it's just amazing. I mean, he became, at a point in time, almost like a mythical figure when they were outing the source. We're worried that the source for Christopher Steele is going to be outed. And to me, Sergei was always kind of emblematic of the larger tactics, in the sense that, as you said, they just kind of picked Sergei. He was convenient. It's kind of like they found General Flynn's dinner and, okay, we can seize on that dinner in Russia as a mean, even though it's completely innocuous, we can seize on that and create this large fictitious narrative around that. And that's what they did to Sergei. And can you imagine, like, if you're Sergei and you suddenly find out that you're the subject of all this in the New York Times, and suddenly you're on this kind of this international scandal, quote unquote, and you had nothing to do with anything. It's just astonishing. And again, it highlights the fact that there's no sense of guilt, no need for proof, there's no remorse. It's who can we find who's useful that we can then destroy as a means to our political ends. And for me, that's the large point in all this, is that it doesn't matter who you are. If you're useful as a means, you're going to be destroyed, run over, dragged through the mud, and that's what has to end. It's symptomatic of the pollution of our justice system, which we've talked about in past episodes. How do we get past that? And I am just angry all over again at thinking about these people that had done nothing wrong and were utterly consumed in the process simply because they could be used as pawns, and with no regard, no thought, no care for those people, all of whom were innocent.
Of course, in Sergei's case, I don't even think I mentioned this earlier. For those who don't know, he was cited by Steele as the source for everything.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
The P-tape, the collusion, 5 years, 8 years of collusion, and every single thing. His server was supposedly used to communicate between Trump and Putin, and on. And I mean, just think of all the worst things in the Steele dossier, and they were all attributed by Steele to Sergei. And then, of course, leaked to the media strategically. And then, as you said, suddenly, you have the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. They're all writing about this guy. And he wakes up in the morning and what the hell's going on? And it wasn't just that, his life was ruined. They ruined his business because they started calling his staff. And then they started calling his clients. And, by them, I mean the media. And then, of course, there was this sort of taint that he was somehow responsible for all these things. And he had never once spoken to, met, communicated, or anything with Steele or anyone in Steele's orbit whatsoever. He had nothing to do with anything. And the one conspicuous thing, and this is where the FBI is so corrupt once more, because so far we've kind of talked about private actions against Sergei, but you know how Steele always made this biggest deal in the whole world that all his sources are super secret, that you couldn't possibly, Putin's going to give them a plutonium cappuccino if I tell you their name. I can't tell you their name. And so Steele hid all these names from everyone, obviously from the media, but he also hid the names from the FBI. He didn't even tell them about Igor Danchenko. The FBI had to eventually figure that out for themselves. And yet, and this is the thing, when it came to Sergei, Steele was out there telling everyone, oh, my super secret source is Sergei Millian. At that point, the FBI should have just kicked the guy out and done worse to him. Because the whole thing was exposed as a giant hoax at that point.
Of course, the answer to that would have led to Danchenko, and that would have been its own problem.
Of course, but just the mere fact that the same guy who in one sentence tells you that, Putin's going to kill all my sources, and in the next sentence he tells you, go after Millian, disgusting, absolutely disgusting. Yep. And when we talk about redemption, Sergei deserves a lot of money for everything they destroyed. He deserves an apology. He deserves not only from all the media but from the government. He deserves so much more. But with all of these things, when we talk about redemption, maybe the biggest redemption possibly is Trump being reelected, because everything that we've just talked about, the reason why all these lives got destroyed was to destroy Trump. So to have Trump rise up again and be president again, wouldn't that just be the biggest redemption of all?
It also reminds me of something we talked about before, and it was a point that you raised initially, and it's the kind of this idea that maybe Trump's loss in 2020 was actually sort of a divine intervention, because he is now able to come back equipped, knowledgeable, having been through, the fires of lawfare in the last 4 years. Actually, I'll believe it when it happens. But the idea that he's equipped mentally, physically, emotionally, etc., to really go after the perpetrators of this, try to downsize government, etc., try to clean up some of these institutions. That's something that wouldn't have happened, at least it doesn't have the same chance of happening if Trump had simply won the 2020 election. So yeah, that would, in a way, it's all kind of tied together, right? It's like the ultimate redemption story all the way around. The administration that was pushed out in 2020 under, let's politely say very cloudy circumstances in terms of how the election came out, is able to come back through all of this and is now poised potentially, to win this election and come back again. That is kind of the ultimate redemption story.
Yeah, it is. It's a long list. We haven't talked. Let's just mention a few other people here who really deserve to be mentioned in terms of what was done to them. Of course, Michael Caputo. He's someone we both know who was put through hell. And you know what it is? What it was in his case. So he advised the Trump campaign on communications matters. And later on he served in the administration in some function. But you know why they came after him? Because he had once lived in Russia. That was like 30 years ago, whatever. Doesn't matter. That's the reason he did nothing wrong ever in terms of anything whatsoever. They ruined not only his finances, but they also ruined his health. He talks about that. You can go and look at his Twitter, and he's someone who didn't take it as calmly as Carter Page and so on. He's properly angry, and rightly so. And I think he's also looking for that redemption we keep talking about, and I hope he gets it.
Yeah. One thing I've always loved about Caputo is, boy, is he not shy. I remember when he got a chance before a committee and just lit them up verbally. You can go and see him going after Andrew Weissman on Twitter. Oh boy. Yeah, he hasn't been as quiet about it, and I've kind of loved to see him do that.
Another one,
again, that's just emblematic. What did they do? They seized on an extraneous event and extrapolated that into something that they could use. Like, that's the common theme in everything we've been talking about.
Exactly. And another one who hasn't been quiet is Svetlana Lokova. Again, a complete and total bystander who has nothing to do with any of these things, nothing to do with Trump world, Trump orbit. She is a British academic, but happens to have a Russian sounding name because I think that she originated from there. What did they do with her? They used her to accuse Michael Flynn of having an affair with her. Why Michael Flynn? Why her? Because they must have looked up the sort of Cambridge, UK kind of events over the past 10 years or whatever. And they found that Michael Flynn had visited there once. And she had been in the same room because, I don't know, it was her part of the university, whatever. I mean, it's just the mere fact that he was in the same room as this lady, they then used that to, again, with zero evidence of any kind. They just made it up. They just said this lady had an affair with Flynn, and therefore Flynn is compromised by Russia, and therefore Trump is Putin's lapdog or whatever. That's always the same chain that they try and build. Anyway, she didn't take it quietly. I mean, she's been very vocal about what happened to her. Ekim as well. Ekim Alptekin is a Dutch businessman. Had nothing to do with Trump, nothing to do with U.S. politics, nothing to do with anything whatsoever. And Mueller came after him hard in order to go after Flynn. And then they wanted to obviously use that. If Alptekin had said anything bad about Flynn, they would have pressured Flynn to say something bad about Trump. Exactly the same process over and over. I mean, in Ekim's case, he had his only, so-called crime was that he had once hired General Flynn's firm. Before General Flynn started, before he became the national security advisor, he had a consulting firm. So after he left the military, he had a consulting firm. A lot of people have firms, businesses, consulting, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. And Ekim just happened to be a client. And the subject matter of what Ekim had hired General Flynn for had nothing to do with Russia either. It was about Turkey. And again, none of this has anything to do with Russia, but they just thought, okay, maybe we can find something here to go. I think, what did they accuse Ekim of? He hadn't registered under FARA, the usual crap. And then we'll use that to go after Flynn. And because
back when nobody registered under FARA.
And then we'll leverage that with Flynn to go after Trump. It's just the same thing over and over and over. And we could name many, many more. But it's just so frustrating. I think I get a lot angry about it than people like Carter Page or Sergei Millian. We talked about them already, how stoically they've kind of taken it all. I get so angry thinking about what was done to all these people. It's completely horrendous. There's so much collateral damage, and it's not just those people. It's everyone associated with those people, their families, their employees, their friends, their
Their
customers, and
financial future.
all of that. It makes me so angry. And yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's one of the biggest. I mean, there's many reasons why it would be great if Trump were to become president again. But for me personally, that one is pretty high up on the list, that it would redeem those people.
What I just can't stop thinking about as we've gone through this is just the idea, and maybe people should take this with them, the idea that all of these people have one thing in common. They happen to have one event, one phone call, one trip, one dinner that could be seized upon when they were all innocent, that could be seized upon simply in pursuit of a narrative that the left wanted to establish. And fundamentally, destroyed them in the process. And fundamentally, that's what we're up against. People who have no boundaries, no ethical morals whatsoever, will do anything to achieve their desired political end. And those are the people that we are up against right now.